مساء الخير وأهلا بكم إلى حلقة جديدة من واشنطن أونلاين. معي أنا هدي العويس على شبكة نورث بريس. كيف ستتعامل واشنطن والعواصم الأوروبية مع إعلان الإدارة الذاتية الأخير عن محاكمة محتجزي داعش القابعين في سجونها منذ سنوات؟ وهل ستحظى الإدارة الذاتية بدعم العواصم الدولية في هذه الخطوة؟ هذا ما أبحثه في حلقة اليوم من واشنطن أونلاين، وضيوفي لهذه الحلقة هما السيد كالفين وايلدر الخبير في الشأن السوري من معهد نيو لاينز الأمريكي، ينضم إلينا من العاصمة واشنطن. ابقوا معنا للمتابعة. سيد كالفين، قرار تاريخي من حكومة الإدارة الذاتية بعد سنوات من الانتظار. قررت الإدارة الذاتية محاكمة سجناء داعش من الأجانب في محاكم الدفاع عن الشعب المحلية الخاصة بشمال شرق سوريا. الدول الأوروبية، الدول الغربية عموما، كانت تشتكي من مشكلة المقاتلين الأجانب في تنظيم داعش وتقول أنهم قنبلة موقوتة، ولكن دون حسم لهذه القضية حتى قررت الإدارة الذاتية اتخاذ هذه الخطوة. هل هذا القرار من الإدارة الذاتية سيحل هذه المشكلة بشكل نهائي؟
So it would be a solution in certain ways. In other ways, it wouldn't necessarily solve the underlying problems. So from the United States' perspective and from the international coalition's perspective, the best case scenario is to repatriate these fighters. Part of that is just pragmatic, that if you're repatriating a fighter to another country, that's going to be a country that already has an existing court system and detention facilities to handle these types of situations, which is going to be a lot easier than creating one from scratch in the autonomous administration's territory. The other issue as well is that even once you've tried and sentenced these ISIS fighters, they still would have to be detained somewhere in North and East Syria. So it doesn't really solve the issue of trying to get them out to somewhere else where they wouldn't be as much of a risk of a jailbreak. So it would solve certain issues in the sense that it would create forward momentum. It would lead to actual convictions, as opposed to the current situation where they're mostly being detained without trial. So in a certain way, it might be an improvement, but in other ways, it would still leave the same number roughly of ISIS fighters detained in North and East Syria, which would still be a long-term problem and a national security problem for the parties to the international coalition to defeat ISIS.
كالفين، مثل ما نعرف جميعا، الإدارة الذاتية وحكومة الإدارة الذاتية لا تمثل دولة صاحبة مقعد رسمي في الأمم المتحدة. كيف ستتعامل اليوم الدول الغربية، تحديدا الولايات المتحدة، مع هذه المحاكمات؟ هل ستعترف بها كما تعترف بمحاكم دول صديقة أو شريكة للولايات المتحدة؟
So it's hard to say, but I think it's fair to say that the United States and probably most of the other members of the international coalition have a lot of anxiety about being seen as trying to foster a secessionist movement in North and East Syria. They've pushed back really heavily against the idea that the autonomous administration is a state or a statelet, and that they're helping to build long-term governing institutions. And I do think that that factors into why the international coalition has historically been pretty opposed to the idea of the autonomous administration trying ISIS fighters directly. That the process of trying them would also be the process of developing long-term sort of judicial apparatuses that might be seen as separate from the central state in Damascus. And the United States, I think, is very reluctant to do that because they don't want to be seen as sort of trying to help North and East Syria break away from the rest of Syria. Although it's worth being clear that the autonomous administration itself also shares that perspective and also shares sort of a reluctance to be seen as doing anything in that space.
كالفين، لماذا لم تقوم محاكم الدول الغربية أو حتى المحاكم الدولية مثل محكمة لاهاي مثلا بحسم مسألة سجناء تنظيم داعش من الأجانب في شمال شرق سوريا؟ لماذا كان هناك تردد كبير في القيام بمثل هذه التحركات؟
Yeah, absolutely. So it's worth emphasizing that they have stepped up to the plate to some degree. So you have seen about 3,000 foreign nationals being repatriated from North and East Syria over the course of 2022. And since 2021, Iraq alone has repatriated about 5,000 members from, or 5,000 citizens from North and East Syria. So there has been some slow incremental progress at repatriating people from other countries. I think that where you run into roadblocks is these countries are oftentimes very reluctant to repatriate people who are seen as having committed serious crimes. So Iraq and lots of other countries have been relatively willing to repatriate the children of ISIS fighters and the wives of ISIS fighters, but the fighters themselves who are actually seen as voluntarily joining the group and participating and fighting alongside ISIS, by and large, most states would prefer to see them remain in North and East Syria. Partly that's because of sort of the political liabilities domestically of voluntarily repatriating them, that these countries, their own citizens really don't necessarily want to see them come back. Part of that is also that once you've repatriated them, you then have to try them. And so it becomes really hard logistically if you haven't built up sort of the evidence base necessary to try an individual fighter. There's always a risk that you'll repatriate someone, not have the evidence to prosecute them, and then they'll just wind up going free in the country. And that could also be a national security issue. And that's something that we have seen several times over the course of the repatriation process.
في ظل تعقيد الوضع القانوني الدولي لمحاكم الدفاع عن الشعب التابعة للإدارة الذاتية، هل ممكن أن نرى الحكومة الأمريكية، الحكومات الغربية تعمل مع الأسد والقضاء السوري وإن كان على مضض لحسم قضية سجناء تنظيم داعش، أم أن المجتمع الدولي سيبقى يفضل التعامل مع محاكم الإدارة الذاتية على التعامل مع نظام الأسد؟
Potentially, I think that you have seen sort of steps from Arab states in order to normalize ties with the Assad regime in notable ways over the course of the past couple of months. And obviously, the most prominent of those being the restoration of Damascus's voting status as a member of the Arab League. The United States has obviously been pretty firmly opposed to that. The United States hasn't taken sort of similar steps to normalize with the Assad regime. So, it's possible that over the long term, the United States might develop very limited ways of cooperating with the Assad regime on sort of critical national security threats. But I think that the United States, it's fair to say, is definitely at one end of the spectrum when it comes to normalizing with Assad, and they're not really that interested in reconsidering how they think about that issue.
هناك تردد واضح حتى الآن من قبل الخارجية الأمريكية، الحكومة الأمريكية في تقديم تصريحات واضحة أو تعريفات واضحة لمسألة محاكمة سجناء تنظيم داعش من الأجانب في محاكم الإدارة الذاتية، ولكن في مرحلة ما سيتعين على الحكومة الأمريكية أن تتعامل مع هذا الموضوع وتقول إما أنها ترفض هذه المحاكمات أو ستقبل بها. ما هو الرد المتوقع من الحكومة الأمريكية والحكومات الغربية الأخرى؟
Right. So I think that there's been this statement, and it's now a little bit unclear what exactly is gonna flow from that statement. So I think that there's kind of a wait and see approach to what pragmatically is going to happen. I think it's worth emphasizing that the autonomous administration has tried and convicted ISIS fighters in the past. The thing that's new now is that they're announcing their intention to try and convict foreign ISIS fighters, whereas previously they'd only tried Syrian fighters. And really only low-level Syrian fighters who would serve relatively short sentences or potentially be moved back into families with guarantors in North and East Syria. So I think that what we're seeing changing is sort of the scale and the type of cases that they're willing to prosecute. I think how much we actually see flow from that, there's a big difference between attempting to prosecute one or two high-profile cases versus trying to work through the entire backlog of somewhere between 8,000 and 10,000 ISIS fighters who are currently detained in North and East Syria. So what exactly will flow pragmatically, I think, has a lot to do with how quickly the AANES moves on this and what scale of prosecutions they actually attempt to undergo.
شكرا جزيلا لك ضيفي السيد كالفين وايلدر الباحث في الشأن السوري في معهد نيو لاينز، كنت معنا من واشنطن.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. It's great to talk.
ختاما شكرا لكل من تابع حلقة اليوم من واشنطن أونلاين، ألقاكم في حلقة جديدة الأسبوع المقبل، إلى اللقاء.